Welcome to the August 2023 LACNETS educational event. I'm Kavya Velagapudi, Executive Director of LACNETS.
I'm Lisa Yen, Director of Programs and Outreach at LACNETS.
And I'm Heather Davis, the Associate Director of Advocacy and Outreach at LACNETS.
Today's presentation is on navigating clinical trials, expectations versus realities, with Taymeyah Al-Toubah. A special thank you to our supporters, Ipsen, ITM, Advanced Accelerator Applications, Lantheus, and Tercera. LACNETS stands for Learn, Advocate, Connect Neuroendocrine Tumor Society. Our name also states the mission of our patient advocacy organization. The LACNETS staff includes Lisa Yen and Heather Davis. The board includes Donna Gavin, who is the sister of LACNETS founder Jayvana Joyce Mbezi, and NET patient Mary Dunleavy, who has been living and thriving with NET for 18 years. We're excited to share that LACNETS is partnering with the Carcinoid Cancer Foundation, or CCF, to provide support line assistance and other programs. For more information, visit lacnets.org/supportline. Now I'm going to hand it over to Heather.
Thank you, Kavya. Our YouTube channel features over 300 videos and podcasts. Use our playlist to find webinars on imaging, PRRT, nutrition, liver-directed therapy, our annual conferences, clinical trials, and PhioPara. Follow LACNETS on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @LACNETS. Be sure to add us to your safe sender email list. I'd like to remind our audience that LACNETS webinars are created for educational purposes only and do not substitute for medical advice. The views shared in this webinar are the experts' personal opinions. Please contact your medical team with questions or concerns about your individual care or treatment. And now I'll hand it over to Lisa.
Because I am a NET caregiver, I, like you, try to stay informed and engaged about the latest in NET treatments and also about clinical trials. We understand that clinical trials pave the way for future treatments. To this end, we recently launched our Clinical Trials Guide, an educational resource that features several key clinical trials for neuroendocrine cancers. You can browse the site by the type of neuroendocrine cancers, such as pancreatic NET, GI NET, lung NET, PhioPara, or high grade. You can also browse by some of the types of treatments, such as PRRT or somatostatin analogs. You can find patient-friendly videos and information about individual trials. We hope this guide will help you better understand various NET clinical trials, and as with all of our content, this guide is for educational purposes only, and we encourage you to talk to your doctor about your individual care and treatment. I'm excited to now introduce today's speaker, Taymeyah Al-Toubah. Ms. Al-Toubah is a Senior Research Project Manager of the Neuroendocrine Tumor Program at Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa, Florida. She has been in research for over 10 years, and her graduate thesis for her master's in public health was on neuroendocrine tumors. For the past 5 years, Ms. Al-Toubah was a primary NET coordinator at Moffitt, and she managed all clinical trials and NET clinic coordination, and she's been working on retrospective and non-interventional NET research as well. She has over 30 published manuscripts and presented her research at several national and international scientific oncology and NET conferences, including ENETS and NANETS. If you have been following the latest NET research, you have likely seen research that she has been involved in or has published. In our December 2022 podcast on the top 10 highlights of the NANET Symposium, Dr. Pena included Taymeyah's 2 oral abstracts, and he referred to her as the ubiquitous Taymeyah. In April 2023, she formally transitioned to a new position as a project manager of the NET program at Moffitt, where she will continue to mentor new coordinators while working on protocol development, manuscript writing, non-interventional clinical trials, and retrospective NET research. One of her first major projects will be to curate and develop a master database of all NET patients seen at Moffitt that will provide the basis for all future NET research to be published there. Taymeyah is an active member of NANETS on the Continuing Education and Symposium Planning Committees, and she plans to dedicate the remainder of her career to this disease and community. Her ultimate plan is to attend medical school, specialize in medical oncology, and continue to serve in the NET community as a physician and clinical investigator. The topic for this webinar came about because she and I have been discussing patient experiences of clinical trials, and we identified some knowledge gaps. We're excited to have Taymeyah here today because she has boots on the ground experience with clinical trials, and she is the perfect person to address some misconceptions and frequently asked questions. Welcome, Taymeyah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Taymeyah Al-Toubah. I'm a senior research project manager at Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa, Florida, and it's my honor to be giving this talk today with LACNETS. And the topic of our conversation today will be navigating clinical trials, the expectations versus realities. So to start off with, we'll take a step back and look at what exactly a clinical trial is defined as by the NIH. To briefly go over this, the NIH defines a clinical trial as a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions. So this can include a placebo or another control. And the goal is to evaluate the efficacy of these interventions, either in a biomedical or behavioral outcome perspective. And so here we have a wide range of what they consider clinical trials. For the purposes of today's talk, we'll be talking mainly about pilot, feasibility, and other interventional trials. And in oncology specifically, most trials are designed to either treat the cancer or manage the symptoms of the cancer and side effects from the treatment. But we also have trials that we're looking into finding and diagnosing cancer and also preventing cancer. You'll hear a lot of terms throughout this. We're going to go through a large terminology overview in clinical trials in general and in oncology specifically. But briefly, phase 1 trials, which you'll hear about often, are the safety and dosing trials. Those are your typical first-in-human trials, meaning the first time a drug is being used in a human population from the lab, or the first time that a specific dosage is being used in a specific way. So maybe a drug that another type of drug has been created very similar to it, but now a new company is designing a similar drug. They're looking at what's the correct dosing in this patient population. The number of patients usually is anywhere from around 10 to maybe a maximum of 40, 50 patients, depending on how the study is designed. If it's one disease site, if it's multiple disease sites, meaning is it a GI-specific study? Is it an all-solid tumor study? Majority of phase 1 trials enroll are what we call disease agnostic, meaning anybody can enroll provided that they've progressed on standard of care therapy. And for phase 1 trials, everybody is getting the active drug. There is no placebo or control arm, typically speaking. You'll hear terms like 3+3 design, dose escalation, dose expansion. Dose escalation is the portion of the trial where we're trying to figure out what the maximum tolerated dose is. And these portions of the trial are very slow in enrollment. They enroll 1 to max of 3 patients at a time typically, and wait for patients to pass a certain period before they can move on to the next dose level to be able to safely escalate the dose. Once they've reached the maximum tolerated dose or the highest dose where few patients have side effects in them, they can move into what we call a dose expansion portion of the trial. The dose expansion is where you may enroll 10, 20 patients at what that maximum dose level is that we reached to be sure that in a wider population of patients, it's still safely tolerated. Phase 2 trials come after phase 1 trials typically. So if a drug passes the phase 1 portion of the trial, meaning we've proven that it's safe at a certain dose level that is therapeutic, and not that we've had to stop at a very early premature dose level, we can move into a phase 2 trial where we're looking at about 100, sometimes 200 patients, although that's more rare in phase 2 trials. And this is where we're looking at, is it effective? Is there efficacy of this drug? So we know it's safe. Now, is it actually worth exploring at an even larger scale? Phase 2 trials are typically less likely to be disease agnostic and at the whole. Usually they're more targeted towards 1, 2, 5 disease sites at a time. That's not to say that multiple trials can't be ongoing in different diseases with the same drug, but typically for the outcome of that drug to make sense in a specific population, that study will be specific to a special type of disease. Phase 3 trials, we've proven that it's safe, we've proven that it's efficacious, we have some level of activity in a certain disease site. Now we move on to the goal of FDA approval. And so this is where you'll have hundreds of patients that you're enrolling over a larger or longer period of time. This is also a safety and efficacy endpoints that are looking at, but mainly response is what you're looking for in a phase 3. So you want to know, does it work better than the existing treatment, if there is one? Does it work better than placebo? And will it be beneficial to move forward in this drug towards FDA approval? This is where you'll have a multi-year enrollment period. So trials usually take a minimum of 3 years usually to complete accrual, unless you have a very rare case where there may not be any drug available for a certain patient population, in which enrollment to a trial may be a little bit faster. But usually these are about 3 to 5 years of enrollment and then follow up thereafter. So it can take several years to get from the trial to FDA approval. Phase 4 studies, which are not commonly talked about because it's mainly a post-market approval. So after FDA approval, they're collecting data on thousands of patients who are receiving the drug to really see what the real-world experience is with that treatment. Are there really any other side effects maybe that we missed in those first 3 phases of the studies? You have a less controlled population, obviously, once a drug is FDA approved. So there's not really any eligibility criteria, things like that, which we'll talk about with enrolling on a trial. So it's more of a real-world experience with the drug. That said, the results of these studies, because they're not as controlled, those results are not as controlled, if you will, as well. I'm going to go through several words that we're going to throw out during our conversations, words that you may have heard as a patient over time and may not have thought to even ask what they mean, or just aren't 100% sure what we're talking about when we're saying these things. So adverse event, an adverse event is just a side effect. So an adverse event is any side effect that you have while on the treatment, really any change from your baseline. So when a patient enrolls on a trial, one of the first things that your research coordinator or your data manager is doing is they're going through your record and they're collecting all side effects and symptoms that you have at baseline. So if you have a rash on your body, if you had a cough at baseline that has nothing to do with the trial or the treatment or even the cancer, we're capturing that information, and then we're monitoring for any trends or any changes from that baseline. It sounds like a scary word, but it's really just any change from baseline that we're capturing is considered an adverse event. Any change in lab function, all of these things are captured in real time and then analyzed at the end of the study to see if there were any trends overall with the drug. An arm or a cohort may not apply depending on the type of trial that you're enrolling in. So a phase 1 or phase 2 trial may not have multiple arms, given that we're just evaluating a single drug or a drug combination in a patient population. We may not have separate arms, so everybody will be getting the same drug, the same dosage, where a phase 3 study may have 2, 3, multiple, or even more than that on the study. So a cohort or an arm will be what you are assigned to. Depending on the study, it may mean different types of procedures that are done and the same drug. So you can have multiple patients enrolled on the same trial with the same drug, but maybe they're evaluating different dosing schedules. So we can give a drug maybe every 3 weeks, or we're evaluating an every 4-week dosing schedule. So you would be on a separate arm or cohort, but really it's the same drug. And other times you'll have a randomized study, which means that a patient is randomized to one or the other of treatments. So either you're on X drug or Y drug. So that will depend on that. A control is whatever we're using as a comparator to the active treatment. And when I say active treatment or investigational treatment, I mean the drug that is under study. For example, if we have a trial ongoing, this is something that's very hot right now in the NET space. So we have an alpha trial, for example, alpha emitter or PRRT with an alpha emitter. We have a randomized trial where we're looking at the alpha emitter versus the standard of care or best supportive care. And so the control in this case is still an active treatment. You are still getting Afinitor or Sutent or high dose of a somatostatin analog. Those are all active treatments, but they are the control in this case because we are comparing the active treatment or the investigational treatment to that. Crossover can mean multiple different things. So some trials will have crossover from the drug that is not being studied, so the control, over to this drug that is being studied. So that would be, again, let's use the alpha emitter trial that's ongoing right now. If patients are randomized to the Afinitor, the Sutent, or the high dose of the SSA, and they progress or their disease worsens over time, if they meet the criteria that's outlined in the trial, they can cross over to the active drug or the investigational drug in this case. And so that's what crossover means. There are different criteria for that. Most of the time, you have to meet the same criteria that you would have needed to meet at the beginning of trial, so eligibility, which we'll go over as well. And maybe there may be less, maybe more criteria that you also have to meet. The type of crossover also varies. So in certain cases, it may be built into the trial that you're already on, meaning it's just another visit that you come in for, you do more testing, you get the drug the same way. Other times, it means that the company may provide the drug free of charge, but it may involve a separate pathway. And so it's important to ask these questions when you hear words like that up front and during your consent to know what the outcome will be for you if you were randomized to the control and needed to cross over. In a placebo-controlled trial, so placebo is defined as something that is a non-active treatment. So where the example of the alpha emitter trial that I just discussed would involve two active treatments, just one that's already FDA approved and one that is not, a placebo-controlled trial such as the CABINET trial, which is comparing cabozantinib, a placebo, which is historically called a sugar pill, not actually a sugar pill, but just an inactive compound that you're taking. So it doesn't actually do anything to your body. It's just a pill that looks exactly like the active drug, but doesn't actually do anything. And so that would be a placebo crossover study is going to be where you are unblinded, and that leads us to our next terms, and where we know whether you were receiving drug or not, and then we can cross you over to the active treatment that you otherwise would have gotten. So a double-blind study means just that, double-blind. I don't know what you're on, your doctor doesn't know what you're on, your pharmacist does not know what you're on, and you don't know what you're on. So really, in a double-blind study, the computer randomizes, allocates whether you're on active treatment or not, and then the drug is shipped in a bottle identical to the drug. Nobody knows except for the third party that is unrelated to the study. So there's nobody on the trial. The sponsor does not know. The sponsor, meaning the one running the trial, the physician that's treating you and all of that, they do not know what you are on. This is possible for things like pill studies, infusion studies, but if you have a study where the mode of delivery of the drug is completely different, then it's almost impossible to have a double-blind study. So for example, a radioactive treatment, you cannot really mimic those conditions to be able to do a fully double-blind study. So randomized trials involving a pill or an infusion, you may not have that option to do a double-blind study, so it would just be randomized and then everybody knows which arm you received. Outcomes of a trial are basically the goals of a trial. So you have primary, secondary, exploratory outcomes that you'll hear, or endpoints, both terms you'll hear. So outcomes are what are we looking for. Primary and secondary endpoints are the primary goals of this trial that we're looking for. So phase 1, usually your primary endpoint is going to be safety. For example, in a phase 2 trial, your primary endpoint will typically be efficacy. So efficacy is determined by usually response rate. In some cases, mainly RECIST-based criteria. So RECIST is another term on here that we have. RECIST is a way that we measure your tumors, your solid tumors on a scan, in order to calculate how a disease is progressing or regressing. And so typically speaking, there are lots of variations to this depending on the type of treatment that you're receiving. They have modifications to RECIST criteria. But typically speaking, it's that if a patient's baseline tumors, we look at your baseline tumors, so you do a CT scan, MRI, whatever you're using for your monitoring of disease, and then we pick the tumors that are most representative of your disease overall, and we track those. And so we track their size, depending on whether they're tumors or lymph nodes. There's different criteria for how we measure them. Typically, anything more than 20% growth overall of what we're following, or anything new that pops up over the course of time, is considered progression of disease. Anything more than 30% shrinkage of disease is considered a response to treatment, and anything in between is considered stable. Like I said, some treatments are more nuanced. So immunotherapy, for example, has separate criteria sometimes because of the nature of the drug, and you should probably ask those questions up front just so you know, what are we looking at? So what is the requirement for me to stay on, and what am I looking at to come off treatment? Just so you have an understanding if that's something that you want to know when going on treatment. So randomization or registration are sometimes used interchangeably. Registration means that we are registering you to a trial after you've been confirmed eligible. Randomization means that you have multiple arms that you could be assigned to, and we are randomizing you to one or to the other. We meaning the study sponsor, the system that's randomizing, not specifically me or somebody else. Eligibility criteria and informed consent, these are hand in hand. So informed consent is what you would sign up front to confirm that you are okay with us completing any tests on the trial and moving forward with the trial. Eligibility criteria is what comes next, and that's what we'll go over that briefly as well. IRB is your institutional review board. That's the ethics committee that has to sign off on any study, making sure that what we're doing is ethical for the goals that we've outlined. Monitoring is usually a third party, sort of a middleman between the study sponsor and the site who's conducting the study. The sponsor is not necessarily manufacturing the drug, but the one responsible for dividing the drug and running the trial. And then your site is going to be where you're receiving treatment. And the monitors are a company that is contracted to make sure that we are doing what we're saying we're doing, that the data we're entering into the systems matches what's actually in the source being the medical record. We all follow a protocol throughout this. So a protocol is basically the Bible for the trial. So this is what outlines exactly what needs to happen when, why. It has windows in there for how much we can veer off schedule, how much we can't, what the side effects are usually outlined in the protocol and in other documents as well. You'll hear things like so PKs and PDs, pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics. Those are blood work usually that would involve additional visits for you sometimes as a patient. Those are things to talk about with your coordinators up front. SAE is a serious adverse event. So we talked about adverse events. That's what a serious adverse event is. Most commonly a hospitalization, but it's really anything that is a higher degree of an adverse event or causes more harm or causes more discomfort. So hospitalization, death in rare cases, a serious event that requires an intervention to prevent something from getting worse, things like that. Those are things that have to be reported immediately, and that's something for your coordinator and your doctor to know about. So anytime you're hospitalized, for example, making sure that you communicate that. Response rate is the response that you're having on treatment. Standard of care, which is what the standard in your case is as an alternative to the treatment that you're being assigned to, potentially. Unblinding, blinding. So unblinding is if you, let's say, progress on a blinded study, that is when you would request to be unmasked. We find out what you were on, placebo or active treatment, and then you would cross over if that's allowed. I just want to note that not all blinded studies allow for crossover, so there's also not always a case where you will definitely be unblinded. There are situations where a patient can go the entire trial and never know what drug they were on. It just depends on how that's designed. A washout period is, each study looks a little bit different, but a washout period is the time it takes before you can enroll on a trial or receive a treatment, and wash out from a prior therapy. That's what that means. So just briefly, the timeline of a trial. So consent I have going all the way through because every visit you really are consenting to. So that is an ongoing thing. While in the beginning of time you do need to consent and agree to participate in a trial, you can change your mind really at any time when and if that ever gets uncomfortable. Your doctor can also decide that something is not safe, something is not working the way that we expect it to work for you, and can suggest it to come off trial. Sometimes there's also criteria that requires us to take you off trial. So consent is an ongoing thing starting from day one and moving onwards. We review eligibility criteria after and briefly before you actually consent to a trial. Enrollment involves the randomization, registration, treatment assignment, things like that, and then usually start treatment. And then follow-up or crossover, end of treatment, there's different types of follow-up. So active follow-up would be a study where, let's say you completed the course of treatment, but you haven't actually progressed. We may be following you with scans. Survival follow-up is where we no longer are required to follow you with visits, but we do want to track a patient's survival, literally that. And so you'll have contact with the coordinator, with the study site over a long period of time. And every protocol looks a little bit different. But you should expect screening to last a few days to weeks, rarely months if it's a more complicated trial and they need blood, tissue, things like that need to be sent off. Enrollment, usually several days. Most protocols have a max of 2 weeks from screening to starting treatment, but again, that depends on the drug. And then treatment depends on how long the course of the trial is designed for, and follow-up can be years to decades, just depends. Your clinical trial team here, just have just this little visuals just so you see how many people are involved on the back end of trials. I'm not going to go through all these people, but this is just so you understand that you may be only communicating with your coordinator, but there are so many people they're also communicating with on the back end to make sure that you're receiving the treatment safely, appropriately, that there's several checks that go into every single step of the process. I've shadowed the pharmacy, I've shadowed the nurses, the labs, just to get an idea of what happens day to day. And the amount of checks that happen for a trial versus a regular standard of care therapy are probably tripled in most cases. And so there is a lot going on the back end. The most important thing you can do as a patient is communicate. So if anything is going wrong at any period of time or you're confused about something, ask your primary point of contact what you should be expecting, or ask is this normal, is this not? And they will figure that out for you and get you an answer. So I'm going to go into a couple of different scenarios and just what I think most commonly I get asked, but also what you should ask or what normal things to expect are with these different visits. So pre-appointments, and what I mean by this is before you've established care at a site that you are looking to go on a trial for. The first question that you should really ask is, are there available slots right now for a trial? I'll show you briefly in a few slides how to best filter clinicaltrials.gov and other websites to figure out where the trials are available, but these are not always 100% accurate. There are contacts on there. You should be reaching out to those contacts listed there. And I would recommend only reaching out to one person at a time for a study. So emailing people at multiple sites for the same study is probably not going to yield a different answer. And we can get a lot of cross communication when that happens and can actually hurt patients sometimes in that sense. And what I mean by that is, let's say I'm running a trial at Moffitt and that same trial is being run at Mayo. And it's a smaller trial, there's limited slots. If I ask for that slot and Mayo asks for that slot, we're not going to know that we've both asked for the slot for the same patient. That slot pool may be decreasing, and then when there are actually more slots, and it's just the same person. And so speaking to one person, communicating with them, and then establishing care at the site that's most appropriate for you or closest to you is the best practice. From there, if something is more convenient elsewhere, they can always transfer you. That's always an opportunity. It may involve some paperwork and some logistics, but that can happen. But I would reach out to one person to begin with and have a conversation about that. Most of the time, so on the back end, we cannot hold a slot formally for a patient who's not established at any facility. And this is universal across the board usually. And so asking the why, just so you can get an understanding of what that looks like, your coordinator should be able to answer that question for you and then help get you in the door to be able to hold that slot formally for you. Things to ask also, are there any glaring exclusion criteria that we can easily rule out? Be very honest in this. When you ask this question or when a coordinator or physician asks you this question, hiding something in your medical history or your prior therapies is not going to make that any better for you once you do arrive. It's not something that we can hide at a certain point. And so being very honest about what treatments you've had, where you are in your course of treatment, who's following you, those are good things to communicate before you've even established care. And then asking a question like how long will it take from establishing care to screening is very crucial for you because you'll know how to plan your life around that. Some institutions have a very long wait time for new patient appointments, but if they know there's a specific trial that you're coming for, sometimes that can change things. Maybe somebody who's less urgent can be moved up, you can be moved in, things like that. And so asking questions about that timeline and then communicating anything that is not going to work for you. Prior to the visit, when you do establish, you want to make sure that all your records are available. Now, of course, you can't do all of that yourself. It's not fully your responsibility, but making sure that you maybe call ahead, especially if you're traveling a far distance, and say, hey, did you guys get everything that you need just so that this visit is as productive as possible? And that will expedite you moving forward after the fact. At that first visit, I recommend, again, open mind and come in ready to answer all questions that the provider has for you. The reason I say open mind is a lot of times patients will come in with, I really want this treatment. This is the thing that everybody's talking about. It's the new drug that's super exciting. I heard that it worked so well in this cancer. I really want it for me. You need to come in with an open mind because what's best for others may not be best for you. And having an expert, a net expert, really evaluate your case and tell you what their recommendation is based on you, not based on, oh, this is an exciting new drug. It may open the door to other treatment options even for you. And maybe what was on your mind was not exactly the best for you at that given time or at all. And so if you're willing to make a trip and you do want to consider a trial, also come in with an open mind that I'm actually seeking this person's expertise out, right? I need to hear what their opinion is on my case, and I need to keep an open mind, but don't cancel an appointment with a provider if they tell you, I can't definitely tell you can go on trial. I've had that happen before where, patients will call, they want to go on a trial, and then when we say, well, we can't guarantee it until we see you, they'll just cancel the appointment and not want to come in. And that's perfectly fine for you to do. But it's definitely in your interest to listen to these experts and hear their feedback. And sometimes the trial is the answer. Other times it may be the answer later. So discussing those things, discussing blackout dates on your calendar. So if you have pre-planned travel, your life and social life is very, very important. So I personally, that's one of the first things I ask my patients. What's on the agenda for the year? What are some non-negotiables that you have? And let's plan around them. It doesn't mean that you won't be eligible for a trial. It just means let's plan as best as we can to fit the trial into your life, not you into the trial's life. You can ask, how many visits, types of visits, and one of the best things to do is to ask, what's the best way to communicate with clinic and research staff? Everyone has a different mode of communication, just like you do. And so communicating that up front helps eliminate a lot of problems that can come in later down the road. And so if your coordinator best communicates via email, let them tell you that and ask for that information. If it's the portal, if it's the phone call, whatever it may be at your institution, and with that specific person, should be the best way to stick to a productive schedule. And then you'll be getting responses in real time. And then at screening and subsequent visits, you want to make sure that you read that consent, take it home, write notes on it, take the time to really read it. And then the time of the actual consent process, that is for you. So we're there to answer your questions, to really make sure that you're comfortable and that you're aware of everything that's going to be happening, even though they're really long, these consents. We can have conversations over the phone, but really don't just take a consent and sign it because you really want to go on a trial. I understand that, but read through it, understand, what are the requirements that you're going to have, what should you expect from the treatment, side effects, things like that. Always communicate if there's any issues while on treatment. So if you're having side effects, hospitalizations, things like that. Some of the most common questions that we get, so what's the process? What should I expect after today? Is there anything we're waiting on from insurance, drug shipments that could delay treatment starting? That's a pretty critical one. Your coordinator should be communicating that with you, or your nurse, but it helps to ask that question just so you know what to expect from the process, if that information wasn't already provided to you. If you're randomized to the control, what's the process going to be like? So can I withdraw from trial is a common question that we get. And while the answer is always you can withdraw from a trial at any period in time, if the alternative to whatever drug you're looking for is really not something that you want or that is appropriate for you, then this trial is probably not an appropriate trial for you to enroll onto. It definitely messes with the science when we do that, when we come off trial before we've started either treatment. It can hinder potentially approvals down the road. It may require for the trial to stay open a little bit longer, where more patients have to enroll, and it may end up slowing the process for you down as well, because if you go through that process and you ultimately don't want to go on XY treatment, you're delaying time that you could have been on a treatment as well off the trial potentially, or enrolling on a different trial. So if you're going on a randomized trial, the idea is that you're comfortable with the randomization, and your doctor should only be recommending it if they believe that it is safe for you to be randomized to either therapy. So a lot of patients also ask, why participate in a trial if I can wait for FDA approval? FDA approval is, one, never guaranteed, regardless of what we go through, and two, it can take years to get from point A to point B. And so even after a drug's FDA approved, you have to wait for it to be added to your institution's formulary. There could be insurance issues, things like that. So if a trial is available, it's an opportunity. Don't think of it as I'm stuck and I could just wait for an FDA approval. How long I'll be on trial is a good question to ask. Do I need to come to the site for all visits? Can I do some things remotely? And then any medications that you can or can't take, ask for a card if they have it with lists like that. Dangerous medications that cross-react with what you're on. Do I have to be transferred? Things like that. Those are things to ask up front. Some misconceptions that we have, so clinical trial participants are guinea pigs. That's not, I can see where that statement comes from, but that's not the point of a clinical trial. The purpose of a clinical trial is to give access to a specific therapy and get controlled data to safely put patients on a treatment down the road. And so most of the time it's an opportunity to have earlier access to a drug if you fit the criteria, and know that this criteria is very stringent and designed to make sure that, if anything, we're overcautious with who we enroll. Sometimes there could be patients who would benefit that are just not eligible because they're not meeting 100% the criteria. Phase 1 trials are hopeless or don't have any benefits. Again, same thing with the guinea pig comment is phase 1 trials, while yes, sometimes the goal is not efficacy, safety. Sometimes you see really miraculous things come out of those drugs. And it's a very, very early access. Patients are fighting for those slots for sure. Phase 3 trials using placebo are not safe or have no benefit. Again, these are designed with safety in mind as well. And so, yes, you may have less of a benefit in one case if you're on placebo. The idea is that nobody will be recommending that if they don't think that it would be either safe for you to be on for a period of time on the placebo, or we really have exhausted all options and the risks, the benefits outweigh the risks in this case. Clinical trials are for people who don't have any treatment options. The most trials are actually, at least in the neuroendocrine field right now, are looking at either sequencing of therapies or new applications of existing therapies and things like that. So it's not a no treatment option, we're expanding treatment options at this point. Sometimes it's for patients who have exhausted all options, and this is one additional one. One thing that is another misconception is that everything is free of charge on a trial. That's definitely not 100% true. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. So definitely ask that question up front. You can leave a trial at your will, well, just like any other treatment. You can receive therapy for side effects with trials. I know a lot of patients immediately think that up front we can't receive any treatment besides the treatment at hand. That's not entirely true. There may be dangerous medications that we cannot give in combination with the drug you're on, but your safety is first. Any side effects you have will be addressed in real time. So don't hold off or tough it out just because you're on a trial. Your doctor receives money from the study sponsor when you enroll in a trial. That's also not true. The study sponsor does cover the costs associated with the trial. The study sponsor does provide financial support to the institution for purposes of running a trial. So the salaries are ultimately supported by the funds that we receive from trials, but that's to keep the clinical trial office open. It's not a cash payment to a physician. If a physician is making money from a company, that is disclosed on the consent. So if it's separate money that a doctor is receiving that's going into their bank account for whatever reason, that's required to be disclosed, and it will be on your consent form. Clinical trials are not only available at large academic medical centers. They're most heavily advertised there, but a lot of smaller sites also do. And then being on a clinical trial, limiting your ability to go on other things in the future also may limit some options. Yes, so let's say it's a PRRT trial and you have a max amount of PRRT that you can receive. That is true. One trial may exclude you from going on another trial, but those are questions you should ask, and it's not an inherent yes or no. So searching for clinical trials, clinicaltrials.gov is still our main source. All trials are required to be registered on here. And I find that the broader you keep it, the better. So this is what the page will look like when you first log in. I typically will just type neuroendocrine into the condition or disease, and I don't fill in the intervention box on that first page. I'll fill in the other terms. This maximizes your output when you're looking for these things because it'll pick up on any keywords regardless of where it's listed in the clinicaltrials.gov outline. And then you want to select interventional if you're looking for a treatment trial. And then once you're on the page, if you see on the left-hand side, it first, without any additional focuses, it pulled 64 studies. But when I filtered it to recruiting and suspended, it filtered it down to 33 studies. So this is a more accurate number. It minimizes the amount of digging that you have to do. You can further, focus this by the location. I typically will leave that open when I'm looking for patients' trials or when I'm personally looking to see what's going on, what's new out there. The reason I do recruiting and suspended is because a study can be suspended for what we call an interim analysis, and this is like a data cleanup where we're analyzing the existing data. It doesn't mean that there are not going to be slots in the future. And so most studies are updated in pretty real time on clinicaltrials.gov, or they should be anyways. So I keep that open. And then recruiting, because I'm not looking for something that's not yet recruiting, you can add that and just look at things that are pending. But if you're looking for something active, I'd leave it like that. And then you get to these pages once you've selected a trial. So on the left, you see this is kind of where the contacts, if you scroll down, it'll show you the contact status. So Tampa, Florida is recruiting for the Raise Bio trial. And then you have the contact email. Don't email the principal investigator or the lead doctor. Email whatever that contact email is. Most of the time, it's going to be the coordinator, or like in our case, we have a group of NET research, and so we have that email, so it goes to all of us who are involved in neuroendocrine. So you're ensuring that you'll get an answer. And then eligibility criteria is a good place for you to look. So you'll have inclusion, exclusion. I know some of this is not going to make a lot of sense for everyone, but it does have the key criteria that you will need to meet to be eligible for the trial. So you can easily weed yourself in or out by looking at that. This is another clinical trial search website. And so Ancora and Josh Mailman of NorCal Carson developed this and have it tailored to several of the patient advocacy groups. So you can find it on the LACNETS website. And it involves a questionnaire that you fill out. While you're doing this, you can target specifically your type of cancer, your primary site. This is just a sample that I went through, and this is the output that I got based on the questionnaire that I filled out. This data is pulled from the clinicaltrials.gov website, which may or may not be 100% accurate at all times, and so just reach out to the contact that's listed on this website. And then on the LACNETS website, you can also find in their clinical trials guide this information and more to be able to help kind of break down how to match to a clinical trial. And lastly, I think the one take home from all of this in general with clinical trials is ask questions and determine your communication style up front. Take lists all the time, communicate with your coordinator or your doctor. And if you have questions before, after, during the process, the more that you ask, the better that your team can support you in all of that. Clinical trials are not scary inherently, but the concept can be. And so just coming in armed with as much information as you can helps you to be a better patient, for us to be better providers, and for that communication to constantly be flowing. There are no stupid questions. There's anything that you can ask that we wouldn't want to answer. And it's okay if the answer is, I don't know, but I will find that for you. That's okay. Don't lose faith when that's an answer, because a lot of these things are unknowns, right? A lot of these side effects, we don't know exactly how to handle sometimes, depending on where we're at in the trial. And so bringing all your fears in and your thoughts in will help us to help you over time. When you're looking for a trial for yourself, make sure that you're not just getting very stuck on, I want to do this and I have to do this, because oftentimes what may be best for you may not be exactly what we have in mind. And so be your best advocate. You are your best advocate. So definitely keep your research in mind when you're having these conversations, but keep an open mind to be able to receive things as well. And anything else that we can do, you let us know. Your teams are here for you. These support groups are here for you. And this network of patients is one of the most incredible and knowledgeable networks of patients I've ever worked with. And so use that strength and continue doing what you're doing. And thank you guys for giving me the time.
Well, Taymeyah, thank you for your time. We're so glad you could be with us today to address the practical aspects of clinical trials. I know you and I have talked about how, there's a lot of information out there in the patient education space about clinical trials and the trials that are out there, but yet there still is a lot maybe that is yet to be answered. The practical aspects that you covered a lot of it. The questions that people might ask, the questions that people had that they don't even know that they have, that you named, misconceptions, and the big picture concept. So we really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And so just by way of introduction to the Q&A, just a reminder for everyone that this session is for educational purposes only. It does not substitute for medical advice, and we encourage you to talk to your own medical team with questions or concerns about your individual care or treatment. And so today, as we talked about, Taymeyah, you have boots on the ground experience, coordinating a lot of clinical trials, doing a lot of research yourself, well published, a very experienced speaker, and we really appreciate you helping us focus on the accessing of clinical trials, the how, the operations, the logistics. So today's focus is more on that and not so much on the actual treatments or the sequencing. So yeah, let's just jump in the first question. And you talked about actually why enroll in a clinical trial and not just wait for FDA approval. Well, another question that comes up that's kind of related is why enroll in a clinical trial versus getting the same treatment maybe off-label? Some treatments we could do that, or going to a different country or another place to get the same treatment.
That's a very valid and real question, I think, for a lot of patients. I think one thing we have to think about is, like we talked about, the clinical trials are a controlled environment that we have to treat a patient with a new drug. And so that answer is going to be different depending on the patient's case. So in some cases, let's say it's a newer drug, we're not 100% sure that this is the right area to give it in. So I'll use an example of cabozantinib. That's a trial that's ongoing in a clinical trial. It's FDA approved in other cancers, has good data in a phase 2 trial in neuroendocrine tumors. So you'll see where that may be a drug that if for whatever reason you don't meet the criteria for a trial, your doctor may feel is appropriate to give you in an off-label use, or like PRRT, when we had finished all the trials and we knew that it was probably going to get FDA approved, there was so much data out there, then it made sense to, all right, we've exhausted the approved standard of care treatments, maybe send you to another country and get that treatment. Those are scenarios where it makes sense, but other scenarios where the drugs are newer, we don't really know, at that point you're kind of treating yourself in a way and not really listening to the experts and to the data that exists out there when you go and try to, force your hand kind of to get another treatment in another country or an off-label use. So it just depends on the scenario when that's a good idea and when it's not.
Yeah. So
There's a
sometimes
lot less monitoring too.
monitoring, that's exactly what I was going to say. So monitoring.
Yeah.
So this is a practical question. So someone asked they're currently waiting to hear a decision if they're accepted into a trial. So what's the average wait time to a decision, and who makes the decision? Is it the pharmaceutical company, the screening doctor, or both?
That also depends on the type of trial that you're enrolling on. So some trials require that your images at baseline be uploaded, for example, to a portal, and then a blinded reviewer, radiologist from the company, actually has to review and confirm that your images meet criteria. So in that case, the decision is twofold. Your doctor obviously has to say, you meet criteria, but then the pharmaceutical company may have a second set of eyes that has to verify that information. And if they disagree, there's a chance that you would not be eligible. The average wait time to a decision, that again depends on the nature of the study. So if there's biopsies involved, if there's outside testing involved, reviews of scans, things like that, it can take a few weeks. I have yet to see a trial that has more than say 2 to 3 week wait time for a decision. And in those 2 to 3 weeks, there definitely should be communication from your study team. So if you're basically not hearing anything for several weeks on end, that's a problem. So I would definitely reach out to your primary contact on that. The only studies that have a really long wait time are things like CAR T trials, which we don't have many in the NET space, but maybe you're on a phase 1 trial or something like that. Those involve some like HLA testing up front. You may have to have some induction chemotherapy, things like that. So that wait time may be a little bit longer just due to the nature of the trial, but that would be disclosed up front.
Thank you. That's helpful. And here's another, logistical type of question. When I reach out to one location for clinical trial and another closer or more convenient location opens up, can I switch sites?
Most of the time, the answer is yes. You can't switch back and forth often with trials, but you can typically switch once. The easiest trials to switch back and forth with, and the easiest trials in general that for transferring sites, are usually government protocols. There's a really clean system involved with transferring. The data gets very easily transmitted from one place to the next. So that process is pretty seamless. But for the most part, yes, you can. You just have to wait for your teams to communicate and like figure out the logistics.
And would this apply also to PRT related trials? No.
Yes, yeah, it does for the most part. I don't know. I can't speak to the trial like for example the NETTER-1 trial. I don't remember what that was like, to be honest, offhand. But I know that for the ongoing trials right now, it is an option. The only thing you have to think about is I wouldn't transfer just from consent to starting. I would wait until you've at least had a dosing date set and then your subsequent doses set. So if you know that you're definitely going to want to transfer for a PRRT trial, the earlier you can tell your team, the better, because sometimes the manufacturing is allocated in certain places. So we might be able to receive 2 or 3 doses a week. And let's say you want to transfer to a site in Texas or in Kentucky, they may already have 2 to 3 doses allocated for the same weeks that you are receiving treatment, in which case they probably won't be able to accommodate a fourth patient onto their schedule in that same time frame. So either you would have to delay your treatment a little bit to accommodate like receipt of the drug and the nuclear medicine availability, or you may have to stay on treatment in the site that you were enrolled at to begin with, and then just transfer when you get to follow up, for example. So all your scans and labs and things like that can be done later.
Okay. And so I hear you saying that each site has certain number of doses allocated to the site. So that's important to know.
Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful. And what if, many people do have to travel for treatments and for trials. If I need to travel for a clinical trial, is it possible to have that consultation appointment the same day as starting then the treatment?
Starting the treatment, I'd say no. Definitely need some time in between. There's a lot of moving parts, even for trials where we have the drug in-house and it's not something that we need to order to arrive. So the screening visit alone will, at minimum, have scans, labs, and a visit with a provider. That alone, you have to wait for the results of all that. And I'm assuming pretty much every single center has to have a second check of eligibility, where you can't just sign off on eligibility with the doctor and send the patient down to infusion without somebody taking a look at that. So at minimum, you're going to need to do all of that. I'd say at least a few days to weeks most of the time it takes before screening and starting. And most places will not screen a patient on the same day that they come in for the initial consultation if they've never met the patient before. So if I have a new patient coming into me, they're interested in a trial, we have to get eyes on them. The records alone don't tell the full picture. So, your records may say that you're feeling well and you're doing great and your labs look great. And, when you come in that day, well, that picture is very subjective in a note. And so when that physician who's actually administering the drug sees you, they can tell you, I know what this drug does to patients. I know the kind of side effects. I'm seeing you now. I don't think it's a good idea to do this. And so that conversation may change too. So at minimum, I'd say a few weeks most of the time if I've never met you before.
Thanks for that clarification. And then let's talk a little bit about costs.
Mm-hmm.
What costs are there for clinical trials? Will there be a cost for the treatment, scans, labs?
That depends on the type of trial. So if it's a trial that is pharmaceutical funded or government funded, we'll just break those two down for a sec. So government funded protocols have a lot less resources, a lot fewer funds. Most of the time, the coverage for those trials is dictated based on the Medicare coverage guidelines. There's not extra money that gets sent just to cover expenses that may not be approved or may have a high copay with insurance. So most of the government protocols will cover the drug for the most part. The administration of the drug is almost universally covered by insurance or the patient or invoiced that way. Labs, it depends. So if it's a study-specific lab that you wouldn't otherwise get on a normal treatment, then that's usually covered by the trial. But if it's a standard of care lab, scans, those are typically covered by insurance or invoiced insurance at least. For pharmaceutical run studies, there's sometimes more resources in that. And so you may find that they may offer to cover a lot more in those cases than government protocols or an investigator-initiated study, which is a study that's only being run at one or two sites and written and kind of funded by the institution that developed that science, basically. And so that's something to definitely ask up front. I'd say most of the time, at minimum, treatment is covered. The only time that treatment's not covered is if we have like a randomized trial, for example, where one arm is standard of care and one arm is investigational. Usually the standard of care will be covered by insurance or invoiced insurance. And so those situations, we had a case last week where we were consenting a patient and I had the doctor write for the standard of care potentially at the screening visit, because we want to know what that insurance coverage is going to look like. How long is it going to take for that to come back? It could take a while for them to approve it, for your pharmacy to be able to fill it, things like that. So just depends.
Yeah, and you mentioned the standard of care. Can you talk a little bit about that? Especially there are those trials where it says standard of care and it could be like a few different options. Who decides that?
Your doctor will decide that after a discussion with you. So in most cases, if it's an investigator choice, that's how the conversation will happen. If it's just one standard of care option, then obviously we'll just go with whatever that trial requires. And the decision's usually based on how you're feeling at the time, what treatment is appropriate in that sequence that they would have otherwise offered you other than the trial. So that's typically how that conversation will go.
Thanks for clarifying. And if there are costs for the trial, how do I find help to help with those costs, including lodging and travel?
Your coordinator should be your primary touch point for that. Your social worker also can help. If the trial covers a lot of things, the coordinator should let you know up front. Most of the time, if the trial's covering, you'll want to go through your coordinator, or some institutions have like a lodging coordinator or travel coordinator in addition to your clinical research coordinator, who you would communicate with. And you want to make sure that you're setting that up the way that they ask you to, because if you don't, then you may be stuck with bills. Then the reimbursement process takes forever. That's one of the biggest pain points, honestly, in the research world, is if a patient covers their hotel and the trial pays for it, but there was another mechanism we should have used, that reimbursement can take months, sometimes years, to be honest. If it's not covered by the trial, which is majority of the trials, your institutions will likely have a lodging coordinator or a social work team. We usually have contracts with like hotels in the area. There may be, if you meet a certain financial criteria, then there may be opportunities that the hospital has. I'd start with the coordinator, and they'll be able to direct you from there.
That's hopeful. Hopefully there are resources.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about side effects and symptoms. If I experience symptoms or issues while on a clinical trial, who do I contact and then what happens?
So who you contact will differ from institution to institution. So some places will have a clinical research coordinator to handle logistics, and then a nurse to handle all side effects. Others will have your coordinator be your primary point of contact, and then they will communicate out to everybody else. So you'll want to ask that during the consent process: who am I supposed to contact? And stay consistent. Because if you reach out to two people, the wires may cross. So if that clinic is not used to trial questions, and you call the hotline, for example, that nurse is just going to deal with it like any other treatment, not keeping in mind that you're on a clinical trial. So figure out what process your institution has, and then from there they'll notify you of what to do. If it's emergent, they'll advise you to go to a hospital or bring you in. If it's not, they'll figure out some sort of touch point schedule. So hey, I'll do this, and I'll call you back in 24 hours, and we'll go from there. They'll communicate with your doctor whenever you have a side effect, and then you may not hear directly from your doctor every single time you call with a symptom, but know that they are communicating with your doctor every single time that happens, and they'll tell them what to do. So, if let's say you call and you say, hey, I'm vomiting, but it's not enough that the doctor says you need to go to the hospital, they'll probably call in a script for something and tell me to check in with you again after the things resolve. And we go from there. But definitely report everything as it happens. Don't wait for things to accumulate too long, especially in the first few weeks.
Thanks. If I'm in a clinical trial, like for example, receiving alpha PRT and end up having surgery for some reason, does that then remove you from that trial?
That also depends on what the surgery was for, where in the process it happened. So let's say you fell and broke your foot and you needed surgery to fix that. Most of the time, trials won't kick you off a trial for having a non-cancer related injury that requires attention. There are guidelines for how long we have to delay treatments in between to safely be able to give you the drug again where it still is going to be beneficial. So those are things that might need to be tweaked when it comes to like delays resulting from a surgery. But if you're on a clinical trial, I'd say almost universally and need a surgery to address a cancer progression event, not necessarily cancer complication, most of the time that removes you from a trial. Every trial is a little bit different. So some trials will allow for, let's say you have a really painful bone lesion and we want to remove that, but that's not something that's really, everything else is looking good and stable. They may not say that you have to be removed from the trial. Radiation is sometimes allowed for pain reasons, things like that. And sometimes it's very cut and dry. If you need to go to the OR, you need to have radiation for whatever reason, you do have to come off. So it depends, and it's something to address as things come up, for sure. But if you are going to need surgery, communicate that before just doing it at another institution. You don't want to end up stuck.
And similarly related to that, how would it be determined if this is a response to the treatment versus the tumor swelling from inflammations and tumors dying off?
That will depend on the imaging, and your symptoms. So, we define progression and response in a number of ways. Objectively, we look at, your CT scans, most of the time CT or MRI, because that's the easiest to actually calculate size of tumors and number of tumors. We have PET scans that can show us activity of tumors as well to an extent. And so your doctor can look at things in a multifactorial way. Sometimes we see the scans tell a picture, but then your side effects tell a completely different picture, and that's where we'll do a little bit more digging. So if your scans are looking a little bit worse, for example, maybe there's not a lot of new disease, there's nothing new really, it's just your tumors look a little bit bigger, but you feel 1,000 times better, you have more energy, your labs are looking better, things like that. That would be a scenario that's probably, okay, maybe the tumors are just swelling and we're actually seeing a response. So maybe we give it a little bit more time. Maybe we do another type of scan, whether that be doing a PET scan earlier than needed, depending on the type of treatment that we're doing. And then the type of therapy you're on will also dictate if that's even something that happens. So if you're on a drug like, let's say, Afinitor or Sutent or cabozantinib, like pills like that, or even chemotherapy, it's unlikely that you're going to have tumor swelling happen during treatment. And most likely, even if we're having that discrepancy and we're seeing a growth in tumors, we're more likely to trust the scans than the symptoms. And then when you have things like immunotherapy, which is known to inflame everything potentially, and same thing with radiation-based therapies like PRRT, that's where we look at that picture a little bit more closely sometimes, and give it a little bit more time, where it's safer to give a little bit more time in those cases.
And when you say a little bit more time, how long would you typically wait for scanning?
For immunotherapy, typically if it's within the first 6 months that we're giving a treatment and you see that inflammation potentially or tumor growth, but everything else is looking good, we'll usually repeat scans 4 to 6 weeks from that first scan that shows progression and confirm or negate the results. So if we do that scan within 4 to 6 weeks and things are still stable or they've gone back to a little bit smaller, then we continue on. If they're looking worse, we usually will change course. And if something obviously comes up in between, then we make a decision earlier. For PRRT, there's not really an established guideline or number of weeks that we wait or don't wait. It's a little bit more up to kind of a multidisciplinary conversation between your nuclear medicine doctor, the radiologist, and then your treating physician. And also looking back at your history with how your disease has presented itself. Sometimes trials will be very cut and dry about this too, even if the doctor would be willing to give things a little bit more time. So that's also sometimes where a scenario like we talked about, that the trial will decide for us if we can continue or not on a treatment. But if we're talking about, and where there is leeway, it can take sometimes a few weeks to make a decision like that.
Yeah, so balancing the protocol and then also some degree of looking at the whole picture and patience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we talk about scans, and particularly I know a lot of people are interested in PRRT. What scans are you doing to assess this?
At baseline for PRRT, you definitely need a PET dotatate scan at this point, whether that's a copper or a gallium-based PET. Octria scans, which we don't really do anymore, are not sufficient to make a decision about PRRT up front. And then a CT or MRI, depending on the best thing for you. So if you have an iodine allergy, we'll typically do MRIs of the abdomen and pelvis with EOVIST contrast. That helps us see the liver tumors better, which most neuroendocrine tumors progress in the liver. And then if you're doing a CT scan, it's usually a 3-phase abdomen. So we're looking at multiple phases of the contrast in the abdomen. And then we'll do a pelvis. And then we always scan on trials, usually the chest as well, whether a non-contrast of the chest, or if we're doing a CT with contrast. In between, I'd say it's rare to do extra PET scans while you're on PRRT. We usually do PET scans at the end of the PRRT treatment, but usually about a year from your baseline. So there's usually a year between each PET scan that we do. Otherwise, you can see a lot of inflammation on those scans. Very few protocols have more frequent PET scans. Sometimes you'll see renal scans that we have to do as well for PRRT. So we need to make sure your kidneys are functioning at baseline appropriately, because your body excretes that radiation through the urine and other bodily fluids. And so the kidneys are a primary place of potential toxicity or side effects there. So we want to make sure that's functioning so you can get rid of that radiation and doesn't get backed up into your system. So those are things that you might see. People with a lot of bone mets, this might not be on trial, but your doctor may choose to do a bone scan as well, just to better picture your disease in that sense. And then brain MRIs only if you have known brain metastases or a suspicion for a brain met.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And then we can talk a little bit more about alpha PRT. I know that's a hot topic, but let's talk a little bit about about the trial names. I think this is an excellent question. How can we tell the difference between drugs in the trials based on the trial names? I've been told, and this person in particular said, I've been told not all immunotherapy are the same.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll start with the immunotherapy part of this, because immunotherapy, while alpha PRRT is kind of the hot thing now, a few years ago, immunotherapy was the really hot thing. And I don't think it's gone away. I think we're just trying to figure out how to use it appropriately in neuroendocrine tumors. So I'm sure we'll hear more about that in the future. But immunotherapy is not just your typical, we hear Keytruda, we hear Opdivo, we hear, Yervoy, those are the ipilimumab, nivolumab, pembrolizumab. Those are the hot ones that we think about. There's other types of immunotherapy, not necessarily the same class of those drugs. So those are of a class of checkpoint inhibitors. But there's other immunotherapy. Bispecific antibodies fall under that in a different way. CAR T therapy falls under that. So those are other types of immunotherapy that we're looking at. There are also other drugs called monoclonal antibodies, which fall into that realm. So it's important to know what the actual drug is that you're going to be receiving. And the way to figure that out as a patient, the easiest way is when you're looking up a trial in clinicaltrials.gov, find where they list the actual name of the drug. And so they're required to do that. You'll see the actual chemical name of the drug, and that way you can Google and figure out what exactly that is. That will also help you figure out if you're eligible for a future trial once you've gotten a drug, because most of the time, if it's an immunotherapy trial, it'll have some sort of exclusion on what you could have gotten in the past. So that's something good to pay attention to. And then the trial names, they come up with all these fancy names to make it a little bit easier to remember. So you'll hear Action One, you'll hear Alphamedics, you'll hear, Cabinet, things like that. Those are good trigger words kind of to remember, okay, this is the trial that everybody's talking about, but really just look at the title of the trial and break down what the actual drug and type of drug is. Don't get too hung up on those, hot names to make things a little bit shorter for everybody. Ask your doctor not to communicate that way sometimes, because it's easy for them to just shoot those names out because that's what they're hearing at meetings, that's what they're using a lot. But definitely look through the title of the trial will always have the name of the drug in it, and then the breakdown of the drugs in the trial will help you figure that out.
Thank you. There's a lot of names and words out there, so that helps clarify a little bit. And you touched on this a little bit, but could you discuss the alpha PRT trials? We know you've done some coordination and work in this, and which ones are out there and where are they and what's the eligibility?
So alpha PRRT refers to the class of PRRT. So PRRT is peptide receptor radionuclide therapy. That includes Lutathera, which is FDA approved. That is a beta emitter. What that means is there are several different types of radiation, but in this case, we have two different types of radiation that we're exploring that is attached to a somatostatin analog. So you have beta, which would be lutetium dotatate, lutetium dotatalk. So those would be like, AAAs Lutathera or ITM's lutetium dotatalk that's in trial. So if you are on the compete or compose trial, that's where you're looking at another beta emitter. And then we have the class of alpha emitters. So it's a different type of radiation. The particles for the radiation are larger. So the way that PRRT works is we have radiation attached to a somatostatin analog, which is similar to the sandostatin or lanreotide that most of us are getting. And so what it does is it delivers targeted radiation to the tumors. And so it attaches to the tumors, gives that radiation, and that's where the alpha and beta differ. So beta alpha is the radiation component, and those can be different types too. So you'll hear actinium, you'll hear lead. Those are both alpha emitting particles, and then you have lutetium or yttrium, which are beta emitting. So you hear those as well. So right now there's two main clinical trials that are ongoing with alpha PRRT. And so that's the RAISE-BIO trial with the actinium-225. And then you have the lead-212 that is being run by AlphaMedix or RadioMedix. So those are the two trials that are ongoing. The RAISE-BIO trial is a phase 3 trial. It's for patients who have already progressed on PRRT in the past with Lutathera or any lutetium-based treatment. And the AlphaMedix trial had two arms. They've completed the naive arm, which was for patients who had never received PRRT at all. And now hopefully will be enrolling soon for patients who have already received PRRT in the past. So the RAISE-BIO trial is open at a lot of sites, and they're opening several more across the country. So there will definitely be more opportunity and way more slots on the actinium trial than there will be on the lead trial. The difference in criteria and the difference in trial design is the lead-based trial, so the AlphaMedix trial, that's only open right now at 4 places. So those are the places that the lead trial is open. The RAISE-BIO trial is open, like I said, almost everywhere. The criteria for the RAISE-BIO trial is, at this point, we're in phase 3, so it's randomized. So patients can either get the actinium or they can get the standard of care, and RAISE-BIO has it set where the standard is Sutent, Afinitor, or high dose of either lanreotide or octreotide, and they do have crossover written into that protocol. The lead trial, and I think the reason that a lot of patients are really trying to get into those is that trial is everybody gets a drug, so there's no randomization on that one. There are very few slots, though. I think the entire protocol is written for about 34 slots total for the refractory arm. So it's very hard, I think, to find a slot for that one. I'm sure we have a wait list. Every other place probably also has a wait list as well. And then beyond that, I'd say other key differences are the RAISE-BIO trial has a few more visits kind of embedded in between. There are more EKGs, some labs. There's some optional studies that you can opt into or out of. The AlphaMedix trial is a little bit more simple in design. There are lots of labs, I'm going to tell you, on both trials. So you're basically getting stuck every 2 weeks for the most part. They're monitoring you pretty closely on these. Scan schedules are a little bit different on both. The follow-up is a little bit different on both, but for the most part, it's two very similar drugs that we're looking at.
So the trials, which one, if any, would also include grade 3?
So the lead trial would include grade 3.
Yeah.
The RAISE-BIO is for grade 1 and grade 2.
Yeah. So so you're saying with both the trials right now, it's only for people who have previously gotten PRRT. Okay.
Correct.
And can you also define refractory when you say PRRT refractory?
Yep. PRRT refractory is a patient who has received PRRT with Lutathera and has then had some response or stability of disease and then later progressed after the fact. The criteria for the RAISE-BIO trial is a little bit more defined on what progression is and what the period of time is. The lead trial is a little bit more lenient on that criteria.
So I guess sometimes people wonder, well, what if Lutathera didn't work for me? Will I still be eligible for the alpha trial, one of the alpha trials?
It depends on what you mean by didn't work. So if it didn't work at all, meaning you never had any stable scan after treatment, it's unlikely you would not be eligible for the RAISE-BIO trial, and I believe most people would not recommend it for the lead either if you had absolutely no benefit. If you had benefit for at least 6 months, most of the time a year that people are looking for, but for purposes of the criteria, it's 6 months that you have to have shown at least stable disease. And then you later progress, that would still mean that it had some activity and that you could explore the alpha emitters.
And what's the minimum number and the maximum number of Lutathera that you could have previously gotten to be eligible?
I don't have it right in front of me, but it's 4. You can't have had more than 4. I don't know that they allow for you to have had less either if you came off for side effects. I think if you, for whatever reason, had to only had access to 2 doses or something like that, that may be something that we could discuss, but you definitely can't have had more than 4 doses.
And what if someone comes to a center like Moffitt and you have both trials open? How is that decided if you're going to go for the actinium trial or the lead trial?
Yeah, so there's some other minor criteria. We're not going to get into that in too much detail, but labs, things like that might dictate why you would be a better fit for one or the other. The other thing is availability of slots and when you actually need the treatment. So if you're able to wait a little bit longer and wait for, let's say, a lead slot, and that is what we're looking for, then maybe we'd go that way. The other thing is the prior therapies that you've gotten. So if, let's say, you've already gotten Sutent, Afinitor, and high dose of an SSA, then it's unlikely that we'd recommend that we re-challenge those drugs. And so maybe we would hold out for a slot on the other trial. But if you haven't received Afinitor or Sutent, if both are appropriate for you, and then a higher dose of the SSA, that kind of maximizes, the Raise Bio trial will maximize your treatment options in a way. It gives us time to figure out, one, how should we sequence these drugs? That's kind of the point of these trials in another way as well. Do we give the Afinitor or Sutent first and then do the PRRT because we have that option in that trial? Or do we give them in the reverse order? So that's more the direction you'd head in, especially if you still have lots of options.
Thanks. I'm sure you get this question a lot. What happens if the platelets are low during a PRRT trial, or just in general during PRRT? Mm-hmm. What can be done?
Depends on how low, right? So sometimes it's at a point where it's low, but not low enough to give you platelets or give you blood or anything like that. Depends on why the platelets are low, if there's another contributing cause. Most of the time, if they're low, but not too low to give treatment, you just receive treatment if that was safe. If they're too low, there's certain cutoffs in the protocols for how low we can go before we have to delay treatment. You may have to delay that. There's a maximum amount of time that we can delay before recovery, while we're waiting for recovery before we retreat. And so if it takes too long, you may not be able to continue on treatment. Oftentimes what will happen is if they're low, we'll hold, wait for it to recover, and the criteria will also be to reduce the subsequent doses. And so you may get either 75% or 50% of the radiation dose at subsequent treatments. And that's provided that it's recovered to a criteria that's safe to continue to give you.
And sometimes patients worry about reducing the dose and what it might mean in terms of, are they getting the full treatment and the full impact from that?
I completely understand that, but what I will say is if we have to reduce to a point where it's not therapeutic and you're not getting any benefit, then we would stop and move on to something else. The danger of giving a full dose when your bone marrow is already impacted or some other lab criteria or side effect is going on, the danger of giving you a full dose of a drug when we've already exhausted that risk is a lot higher than the potential benefit of getting the full dose. I'd rather a patient, and this applies not just for PRRT, this applies for any drug, I'd rather a consistent lower dose where you're still getting treatment, active treatment throughout this time, than a higher dose that we have to give, once a month, and then we have to keep skipping a few weeks every single time. This applies to pills, chemo, immunotherapy, things like that.
Yeah, that's helpful. And speaking of, PRT maybe not working, what other options are there if PRT didn't get the result intended?
That depends on where you are in your treatment cycle, the primary site of disease, what treatments you've already gotten, what trials besides that are available. PRRT is one other drug in our arsenal of drugs. And I think we a lot of times think of it as a separate class, right? And it is a different type of treatment, but it is another systemic therapy that we have in our toolbox of all drugs. So the same way, if Afinitor didn't work and we move on to PRRT, it's the same concept. So if PRRT doesn't work, depends on where your progression is and why it didn't work, right? So if you're only progressing in the liver, you might look at liver-directed therapies. If you're progressing everywhere, either another trial or other FDA-approved drugs that exist for your primary site of disease. So just think of it as one other tool.
Thanks. So if I'm getting a treatment through a clinical trial that's working for me, how long can I stay on that drug? And will I be able to stay on it even when the trial's closed, or if that arm of the trial is closed?
That depends on how the protocol is written. So some trials are written where as long as it's working, you continue, and the company's obligated to provide that drug to you in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes if the drug goes to FDA approval, then they will close the trial completely and they'll force everybody off, and then your doctor will have to prescribe it through your insurance. When we talk about closed, sometimes we're referring to closure of accrual. So it means that we've put all the patients on that can go on in the slots that we had, but it doesn't mean that the trial is not, the operation of the trial doesn't continue on. I had a patient who I want to say was the last person standing on the pazopanib trial. She was on for almost 10 years. And so if the drug is working for you and the trial is written that way, you'll continue on.
Thank you for clarifying that word close. I think that can be scary, and I know that happened when that lead trial,
Yes.
that arm closed too. Some people are like, does that mean I stopped my treatment?
No.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying. This is a good question. Are there any clinical trials that would address the difficult treatment of NETs peritoneal carcinomatosis?
I wish. That's one of those things that's very unique and hard to kind of put into an objective clinical trial. It's more of a case-by-case basis. It's important that you go to doctors who have experience seeing this. So if you have a lot of peritoneal disease and it's limiting your ability to get treatments, or things are making your lifestyle is just very difficult as a result of that, make sure that you ask around and talk to somebody who has experience, or are referred to a doctor who can address that. But a trial just for that, no, not at this time.
And how about, are there any trials or interest in looking at the efficacy of neoadjuvant or adjuvant treatment for NETs other than pancreatic NETs?
So that's something that also we have to think about the biology of this disease and when these diseases are usually diagnosed. So the reason that there are neoadjuvant adjuvant treatments in trial form for pancreatic NET right now is because this is an area that we catch earlier on than others. So most small bowel neuroendocrine tumors are diagnosed when the patient's already metastatic, so that doesn't really apply at that point. There are neoadjuvant and adjuvant treatments for NETs of all primary diseases in guidelines. So that's something that we don't talk about a lot. And on the patient-facing side, there are guidelines and there are trials. And sometimes there are guidelines that don't need a separate trial to establish a set way that we do things. So if a patient comes to us with a stage 1, stage 2 rectal neuroendocrine tumor, small bowel neuroendocrine tumor, your tumor board and your doctor are going to have a plan in place depending on the pathologic features. So what the grade is of the tumor, how much it's invading a certain area, things like that. They're going to have a plan in place for neoadjuvant adjuvant treatment in those cases based on literature. That's where a lot of our retrospective data comes into play. That's where a lot of just experience over time with this cancer and other cancers. We can use applications from other cancers in our space here. So while there may not be a trial, a formal way of looking at that, it's usually because it's not feasible. It's going to take decades to enroll a certain amount of patients. And by the time we publish, it's meaningless. We would have accomplished the same thing otherwise. But we absolutely do treat adjuvantly and neoadjuvantly for all types of tumors, depending on where you lie.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to take a couple more, and this is a really Practical question. How do I find out the results of the clinical trial? And will I find out the impact of my participation and how my participation contributed to science?
You will. Your name and your information won't be published directly, so you're not going to be able to see, hey, I'm patient, 15, and I see exactly my data out there. That's never going to happen, and if it does, that's kind of a problem. Um, but the results of the clinical trial are all published in whatever journal that study decides to publish in, but they will be posted and required to be posted on clinicaltrials.gov. The thing I will say is it takes a bit of time for it to populate on there. But if you go on PubMed and just search the trial number that you have, if it's published, it'll be on there. And the way that you can look that up from your consent form, keep that consent form or scan it in when you get a copy of it. There should be an NCT number in there or another number identifier that the sponsor has in there. And that's what I would use to Google or search on PubMed the study that you're looking at, because the results will be tagged to that.
That's really helpful. And so we'll just end with this final question. We know, Taymeyah, that you have a long career ahead of you as a clinician and researcher. So I'm curious what clinical trial or advances in the NET field you're most excited about.
One of the big treatment advances that I'm excited for is the CAR T space. I'm really interested to see where that goes. I know Penn started already their trial, or they're getting their trial started, and we're hopefully getting close to at least starting the trial process for the drug that we've developed along with Italy at Moffitt. And so that's a space that I'm really excited about. I think that has probably the highest chance of getting people into remission, and that's something that is always a goal, right? Immunotherapy in general, I'm very excited about, but that's one treatment that I am. The other thing is finding. I wouldn't say that we already know this answer, but I really hope that more effort goes into figuring out the best way to treat and control poorly differentiated neuroendocrine carcinomas. There's a lot of other things I'm excited for, but those I think are two unmet needs. We don't have a lot in the poorly differentiated space. Those are very, very aggressive, and by the time you're treating them, things are most of the time pretty bad. Immunotherapy, I think, has a big potential to tap into that space. It's just figuring out exactly what we need to target to get that to work in a higher percentage of patients than we already have.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this time. If you have any closing comments or words of hope you want to leave the community, you're welcome.
Thank you so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to interact with everyone. And this NET space is one of the most incredible patient populations that I've ever met. And so I'd say keep doing what you guys are doing. You really are your best advocates, and really prove that time and time again, and just keep showing up for each other and for yourselves. And hopefully whatever you guys need, I'd love to hear about, so that we can kind of push forward. We need that feedback to be able to figure out what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. So that's the only thing I would ask of is more communication that's directed to us. But thank you so much for giving me this time, Lisa.
Well, thank you. And thank you for all you're doing on behalf of the NET cancer community. We really appreciate it. And communication is key. We're stronger together. And this is what this webinar is about, right? Communicating,
Yes.
getting information out there, talking about our unanswered questions, and just opening up the conversation so that we can have more treatments available for all of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to send it back to Heather in the studio.
Thank you again, Taymeyah, for that insightful and useful presentation, and for answering those important questions from our audience. Educational programs like today's are made possible by our supporters, Ipsen, ITM Pharmaceuticals, Advanced Accelerator Applications, Lantheus, Tercera, and by donors like you. Please consider making a donation today at lacnets.org/donate. And a special thank you to our technical director, Rich Tamayo from TVP Live, for this high-quality broadcast production. Again, follow us on social media to stay up to date on our upcoming events. Our handle is @LACNETS. And now back to Lisa.
Thank you, Heather. We recognize that you are more than your disease, and we aim to support you as a whole person. To this end, we offer many resources and programs. Find out more on our website, LACNETS.org. LACNETS has a monthly podcast featuring experts who answer the top 10 questions in their field. This month's episode is on well-differentiated grade 3 NET. Go to our LACNETS podcast page to check out the transcript, resources, and the questions we asked the expert. Thanks again for joining us. Goodbye, and we hope to see you in person in Bethesda next month.